Hello, universe. Many of you commented that you enjoyed my real analysis textbook video, and so I wanted to make this video for you all. And especially for those of you who have not heard of this topic, it's called optimal transportation, okay? And this is a topic that completely changed my life, okay? And if you like real analysis, I can almost guarantee it will change your life if you have not heard of it. The reason is because optimal transport essentially tells us if we have two different measures, or you could think of them as densities with respect to the Lebesgue measure, so we have two different functions. Optimal transport tells us the optimal way to transport one of those measures onto the other with respect to some cost, and that allows us to put a distance on measure spaces. And it actually gives us a geometry of, like, for example, the probability space. If I look at the space of all probability measures on, let's say, Rn, then with finite second moment, then optimal transportation provides a geometric framework for understanding, or it literally provides a metric which provides a distance between probability measures, and this induces a geometric analysis of PDE. And this is a huge topic right now. It's really blowing up. It was recently, there were recent developments within the past 30 to 50 years that really just kind of blew open the door for optimal transport. And so this is a huge topic, and it is currently blowing up in math. And I wanted to recommend some textbooks for those of you who haven't heard of optimal transport, but maybe you have some background so you could get started and maybe learn a little bit about this. And I promise you that if you love math and if you love real analysis, this topic will probably change your life. It definitely changed mine, and it's one of the two subjects that I've literally cried. I have wept over this subject in terms of its sheer beauty and the unity that it provides in kind of bringing together my years of study in real analysis and giving them some geometric intuition. So the prerequisites for optimal transportation, should just mention, are going to be real analysis, okay? You need real analysis to you need an understanding of measure theory and understanding of integration theory, which is covered in a real analysis course. Now, the textbook I recommend would be Folland, but there are other textbooks that I have recommended in my previous video for this background. Now, another prerequisite towards optimal transport is going to be some understanding of partial differential equations. This is the graduate level textbook that I recommend by Evans. You don't need to understand this entire textbook, and it's less of a prerequisite, but it still is an important prerequisite. The important things from PDE that you want to know are going to be the continuity equation. It's probably the most important thing. And then just some basic ideas from PDE. So you don't need this whole textbook. It's just a recommendation. So now let's jump into the textbooks for the theory. So the first textbook I would recommend getting started with is this book by Villani, Topics in Optimal Transportation. Villani is a master of the subject. I believe he's won a very prestigious award. I believe it was the Fields Medal. I'm not sure exactly, but he's very renowned as a mathematician, and his explanations are very precise. He is a bit verbose, so he does, after every theorem, he'll provide like 4 or 5 remarks explaining the theorem and some intuition or some comments about the theorem before he actually proves the theorem. And it's actually pretty funny. I've never seen an author give so many remarks before actually proving theorems. But it's kind of cool. It's nice. It interrupts the flow a little bit, so you might want to just skip the remarks, read the proof of the theorem, and then come back to the remarks. But, the remarks are nice to have because they provide a little bit of intuition and a little bit of personal flavor of what Villani sees and the things that Villani thinks are important to note about the key theorems. And it does start from good intuition. I really like some of in optimal transport, there's a lot of intuition that goes into first learning these constructions. And so I do like the way that Villani approaches this, but there are some downsides. I think that the way that he proves the Kantorovich duality is he uses a functional analytic method. He uses basically Hahn-Banach and functional analysis to prove the duality via minimax argument. And This is, I think, a little bit too technical for this introductory level. I think that it's a great proof. It's really an excellent proof, and it's good to go over and understand how it works. But I think that this next textbook, or not this one, but this textbook by San Ambrosio does a better job of, at the first introductory stage, proving the duality with using C transforms, which is a better, I think, way to first learn why the duality exists. So this would be my first recommendation. My next recommendation is, this is, so I recommend that you read probably like the first chapter or two of this book, and then you start off with this. This is the San Ambrosio textbook, okay? So San Ambrosio, Optimal Transport for Applied Mathematicians, okay? So this is also an introductory level book. I'd recommend it alongside this book by Villani, and honestly, I'd recommend this as the first, probably the better book to just start off with. So, either starting off with this book, or for the intuition, starting off with maybe chapter 1 of this book and then moving on to San Ambrosio is probably my recommendation. San Ambrosio is excellent. Both of these books have exercises, by the way. San Ambrosio is excellent. It's a great introductory to the topic. It's still an advanced textbook, but it has... so basically, we can just go through the table of contents here. So... yeah, and I think I've read pretty much this entire book all the way through. Maybe I skipped 1 or 2 chapters, but I've read almost the entire book. It's very well written. It's a very good start. Like, it's a very good start if you're just wanting to learn and you haven't read anything about optimal transport, but you know some real analysis. You can really start here. So you see that in chapter 1, we cover the primal and dual problems. This chapter 1 alone is just a very important concept. Chapter 2, we get to the one-dimensional framework. So some one-dimensional kind of intuition. Then 3 gets into the special case of L1 and L infinity. You'll see that in L1 and L infinity, there are different sort of, L2 is the most geometric case, and then L1 and L infinity are kind of the edge cases, and they need to be treated a little bit separately. So chapter 4, we have minimal flows. This is kind of setting up some of the calculus of variational framework that you're going to need. A lot of this stuff is like a variational framework of PDE. So one of the powers of optimal transport is that optimal transport is able to reformulate a lot of PDE as some sort of calculus of variation, like gradient flow with respect to some energy functional. So for example, the heat equation was discovered to be the gradient flow of the entropy functional, the thermodynamic entropy functional, with respect to the Wasserstein metric, which is the metric induced by this theory of optimal transport. So with respect to the L2 metric, it's some different functional, and the heat equation is some gradient flow of some different functional with respect to the L2 metric. But with respect to the optimal transport metric called the Wasserstein metric, in fact, the heat equation is the gradient flow of the entropy functional, which is the thermodynamical intuition. It kind of backs our thermodynamical intuition about the correct or the intuitively correct functional, which whose gradient flow should be the heat equation, right? Should be the entropy. So anyways, this is kind of covering some calculus of variations background, and then you can see 4.1.2 here is going into the continuity equation. So that's the most important PDE that you're going to need for this optimal transport theory. And then let me get into Wasserstein space. So here we talk about the metric. You can see it defines the definition and the triangle inequality. Essentially, we're getting a metric from optimal transport. We get a metric on the probability space. WP is a metric on the space of probability measures with finite pth moment, essentially. Okay, and the cost function is essentially some x minus y to the power p. So as you'll see if you study this material. So then we look at some numerical methods. This chapter I really like of this textbook because this is not something that's offered in Villani. Okay, so it's kind of an introduction to some numerical methods. You can see the first numerical method is Benamou Brenier. This is very important. For those of you who are kind of getting into the subject, you want to read, there's a very famous paper written by Benamou and Brenier basically on fluid mechanical computation of the optimal transport problem or something like this. I'll post the link in the description, but it's like one of the landmark papers in optimal transport theory. It was published relatively recently, and it provides basically a fluid dynamical reformulation of all of optimal transport. And essentially, it provides basically a variational interpretation of the optimal transport distance between two measures as essentially the vector field of space-time vector field, which solves the continuity equation between these two measures solves the continuity equation which interpolates between the two measures, but also simultaneously minimizes kinetic energy. So you actually get, with the Benamou-Brenier algorithm, you get kind of a variational framework that is very similar to Lagrangian mechanics, but it's a sort of an infinite dimensional version of Lagrangian mechanics that can be extended to fluid mechanical ideas. So it's extremely powerful. This is one of the most powerful algorithms, and it's one of the reasons why optimal transport has blown up in recent years. Okay. And then they go through some other numerical methods as well, but they don't cover them as in depth, but it's a good introduction. Then they start talking about functionals. This is critical. This is going to be some more theoretical build-up here in this chapter 7, functionals over probabilities. We're going to be building up kind of the notion of a functional and the important properties, semi-continuity, convexity, first variations, etc. And then finally, we get to chapter 8, gradient flows. Again, chapter 8 is the highlight of the chapter. Gradient flows, essentially, you start with a functional over the probability space, and then you can understand the gradient flow of that functional. So essentially, starting with a measure, how you create a curve of a time-evolving measure, and that curve essentially moves along the path of steepest descent of this functional. So the classic example is, again, the entropy functional. If you begin with a delta mass, essentially what's going to happen is, if you want a gradient flow with respect to the entropy, that means you want to maximize entropy, and you're essentially going to apply the heat equation to that delta mass, and you're going to get an expanding Gaussian over time. And that's going to be the curve in this measure space, which maximizes the entropy, or minimizes or maximizes. You could say in mathematical terms it would be minimizes, but in physical terms, in the terms of physics, it will be maximizes the entropy functional. Okay, so this is like one of the most powerful applications of optimal transport theory. Although there are literally a ton. This is like just such a useful theory. So yeah, that's what this textbook covers. And then gradient flows. Okay, so this essentially, once you get into gradient flows, this is all done in Rn. Okay, so first of all, both of these textbooks are done in Euclidean space in Rn. And then, or they're done over, okay, they're actually not done entirely in Euclidean space. They're done over what's called Polish spaces. So they aren't done in Euclidean space. They're done over Polish spaces. But kind of the intuition is very Euclidean, okay? So I really should emphasize these textbooks are not done only in Euclidean space. They are done in the arbitrary framework of Polish spaces, but a lot of the intuition is in Rn, okay? And some of the specialization is towards Rn. Then this book by Francesco Maggi is actually very specific to Euclidean spaces, so it's another good introduction. Okay, so the two that we've just covered are introductory textbooks. Here's another introductory textbook by Francesco Maggi. This textbook, we were doing a workshop in the graduate math department on optimal transport, and we were giving weekly lectures, and it was following this textbook. So I really like the textbook. I've read only a couple chapters of this. I have not read the whole thing. I plan to go back and do the exercises in this textbook. It is very well written, okay? It is a great take on optimal transport. I highly recommend checking this book out as a possible alternative to an introductory level textbook, okay? All right, now after these textbooks have been covered, here's a great review resource, okay? This is a wonderful resource. I've read most, if not all of this. I think I've read most of this book, but it's a very short book, okay? So it's not a long book. It's a lecture book. So, and it's lectures on optimal transport. Now this author is one of the famous. Ambrosio is one of the top people in this field here, okay? not to downplay the other two authors. All due respect to them as well. Yeah, if we just look at the table of contents here, we have kind of goes through a lot of content very quickly, okay? And so it's going to be the same these same introductory concepts that were outlined in San Ambrosio and some of the other spaces, but you can see that even at the level of lecture 10 and 11 and 12, we start getting into gradient flows, but maybe a little bit more in-depth coverage. It's going to be an overview coverage. It's not going to be as in-depth as a textbook. It's going to be a great overview. And then lecture 13 is some examples of gradient flows. Then so eventually we get to, eventually we start to get a little bit into the Riemannian manifold side of things. As you can see, lecture 19 gets into optimal transport and Ricci curvature. So there's a lot that has to do, basically, there's a lot of relationship because optimal transport is so geometric. It has a lot of relationship with Riemannian geometry, and so those relationships are currently being explored in research. And that's one of my research interests. But you can see that by the end of these lectures, we get to Otto's calculus in lecture 19. So there's actually quite a few lectures, and we get to a little bit of differential geometry flavor in the final lecture. But there's a lot of great material here that's covered at a very overview, kind of a rapid pace. But the lectures are really readable. Despite being pretty condensed, it's really readable. And I got by reading this after I had already read just San Ambrosio. And so I read this book, and then I just read this, and it was a great overview, covered a lot of the material. Sometimes even the proofs were honestly better written or like more readable. I really loved this book. I would highly recommend it to anyone if you're trying to kind of condense and summarize the information that you've learned once you've studied one of these introductory level texts on optimal transport, okay? You can also use this as a supplement. I would also recommend just reading this alongside one of these three textbooks that I've highlighted here, okay? So this is a great resource. Now, we get into the two more advanced books on the subject. So the first book is the longer book by Villani. This is a book that I'm currently reading called Optimal Transport, Old and New, okay? And this is kind of the famous book. It's quite long, and this book basically covers a lot of Riemannian geometry. So before you get to this textbook, you're going to need a prerequisite of Riemannian geometry. Let me just pull that out here. So before moving on, you need this prerequisite of differential geometry, of Riemannian geometry, okay? This is the textbook that I would recommend. Many people like this textbook by De Carmo. I personally find that I learned better from this book by differential geometry, okay? But you're going to need a prerequisite of differential geometry no matter what. Once you get this prerequisite out of the way, then you can start tackling this textbook, and you can see here that, hopefully my phone doesn't die. Can see, let's look at the table of contents here. So you can see that the part 1 of the textbook is, I'm on chapter 7 right now. Part 1 of the textbook is still a review of all of the concepts covered in these 3 books, the introductory level textbooks that I previously mentioned, okay? And now, once you get to chapter 7, though, you start looking at notions of geodesics on manifolds, and you start looking at notions of geodesic convexity, and so you start generalizing things to the framework of Riemannian geometry on manifolds. And then part 2 is entirely optimal transport and Riemannian geometry, and you can see that all of the work is done in the context of a Riemannian manifold, not just Rn. And so there are immediate consequences to general relativity. In fact, there are huge connections between general relativity and optimal transport that are currently being investigated, not to mention just connections between optimal transport and physics writ large. But you can see that one can understand the curvature of a manifold via the geometric properties of optimal transport, and that somewhat intuitively makes sense if you consider transporting like a Gaussian on Rn. If you just transport a Gaussian to a different Gaussian, maybe with the same variance, that is just going to look like a translational, the geodesic path is just going to be some sort of translation, whereas if you have a curved manifold, you might have that the variance of that Gaussian is going to change depending on the curvature of the manifold, and so you can understand the properties of optimal transport through understanding the curvature and vice versa. Okay, so critical topic, and this is another textbook, Cedric Villani, and then we have the ultimate reference. Okay, now these two references are this one is more of a Riemannian geometry side. This is more of a reference for the actual theory of optimal transport. Okay, this book by Ambrosio, and then I can't pronounce the other two names, so I won't try, but credit to these authors as well. This book, Gradient Flows in Metric Spaces in the Space of Probability Measures. Every paper almost that I've read several papers on optimal transport. Almost all of them are citing this textbook. And there's a reason why. This textbook contains like all of the critical theoretical buildup that you need to understand, to start reading the current research being done in the field, okay? And it's mainly part 2 of the textbook. So you can see the textbook is split up into 2 parts. Just pull it. Yeah, so part 1 is gradient flow in metric spaces, okay? So this is different than, normally the gradient flow is defined with respect to a derivative, okay? So with respect to some derivative operator. But one can define gradient flow in a more general way just using a metric. If you look at the discretization of a normal gradient flow equation, you can generalize that discretization form to just an arbitrary metric space. And so covers this theory in part 1, but part 2 is the critical side. So part 2 is gradient flow in, part 2 is more critical for optimal transport, okay? So part 2 is called gradient flow in the space of probability measures. Does some preliminary results on measure theory. We have reviews optimal transport. So this chapter 6 and chapter 7 are going to be things that you would have already covered in these introductory textbooks. And then chapter 8, but again, it's going into them from a kind of a more rigorous perspective, honestly. And then, so this is way more technical than the previous books, by the way. So it's going through some of the similar concepts. So it goes through some of the subdifferential calculus, gradient flows. So it's the same sort of subjects as these introductory textbooks, but it's way more technical, okay? So this is going to be it's going to take a lot longer to read, and the proofs are more technical. They're done in more generality. However, it is the ultimate reference, and it should be, if you really want to understand optimal transport, then you need to go here. Once you've already introduced yourself to the subject, you need to read part 2 of this textbook. It is the standard. It is literally the standard right now, and almost every paper is citing part 2 of this textbook. And like I'll literally, it's gotten to the point where I will be reading a research paper and I will see a citation and I'll know that it's this textbook without even having to check the citation. That's how much this textbook gets cited in the research, okay? So anyways, now going back, so once you've covered this introductory material, another alternative thing you can study before moving on to these more rigorous textbooks, another awesome thing you can study is these lecture notes by Marcel Nutz called Introduction to Entropic Optimal Transport, okay? These are really good notes. I loved these notes. These are some of my favorite lecture notes I've ever read, and it's super, super important. Basically, it creates the theoretical framework for something called the Sinkhorn's algorithm, which is a much faster way to compute optimal transport, and it basically does so by regularizing with respect to some entropy. So it's this notion of entropic regularization, which allows one to kind of almost like smooth out the process, or make the optimal transport plan more diffuse relative to the product measure, and so that allows for easier computational flexibility. And this is the primary algorithm getting used right now, or one of the biggest algorithms getting used. It's one of the fastest, okay? When it's done numerically and correctly, it's one of the fastest algorithms for optimal transport today. So you have this algorithm, you have the Benamou-Brenier algorithm, among many, many others. But this is definitely one algorithm to learn if you're into the numerics. And it's all done theoretically in this book. Or in these lecture notes. I would highly recommend this. Another resource that I will recommend is a resource that you can cover after having covered one of these introductory level textbooks. Let's say you covered even the first few chapters of this book by San Ambrosio, cover the first few chapters of this book. Then I actually gave a lecture at my university. They asked me to give a lecture on the Kantorovich problem. And so I gave a lecture on this, and I created these lecture notes, and they're online at mathsheets.com with a Z, okay? So you can find these lecture notes and download them for free online. Basically, I synthesized from all of these different textbooks as well as other resources, I synthesized my understanding of the Kantorovich problem. And a lot of the proofs I actually proved like with my own, I didn't just copy and paste the proofs from the textbooks. I kind of proved them based on my own memory and my own understanding. Of course, I had seen the proofs before several times, so I knew how the proofs were supposed to go, but I kind of wrote them mostly from memory. Of course, I referenced the textbooks throughout, but for the proofs themselves, I tried to write them from memory so I wasn't plagiarizing. And basically, I have a lot of comments here. I have a lot of kind of analysis of my own thoughts, and this is probably one of the best lecture notes that I've made. I have a nice table here which describes the exact kind of duality statements that one can achieve with different assumptions about our spaces and our cost functions. So you can see here that once you understand the dual problem and the Monge problem, the Kantorovich problem, and the dual problem, and this variation of the dual problem, then you can really this is a nice table which references all of the necessary assumptions and type of cost function, the duality statement, and then whether or not you have uniqueness of the optimal transport. So yeah, anyways, I spent a long time on these notes. And if you are, this is kind of a shot in the dark, but if any of you actually do check these out, and maybe you are interested in learning optimal transport theory, and you do learn some optimal transport theory, any feedback that you have would be greatly appreciated. I love feedback on any of my writing, and this is probably one of the most technical lecture notes that I've published on my website. And so, yeah, any feedback would be much appreciated. Making this video for all of y'all because, I didn't plan on doing this video at first because most people don't really know about optimal transport and they kind of view it as a niche thing. But I really believe that optimal transport is one of the futures of math. It's not the future of math, but it is a subject that will gain more and more of a following in the years to come. And this is going to be a big, big field. It's already blowing up because of the connections it has with physics, as well as just AI and machine learning. But people have been deriving, for example, the Schrödinger equation via stochastic generalizations of optimal transport theory. And optimal transport is providing a bridge between classical and quantum mechanics because it basically provides the infinite dimensional framework that is needed to pass from a deterministic model of the universe to a statistical one, a statistical model of the universe which incorporates mass distributions throughout space. So yeah, I mean this subject changed my life. I really recommend, if you don't know anything about it, please just trust me and give it a shot. Just even read it for a week and read, I would recommend if you're only investing 1 week of your time, then read chapter 1 of Topics in Optimal Transportation by Cedric Villani. Read chapter 1 of this textbook and just get a feel for what optimal transportation is all about. It just might change your life. It certainly completely changed mine. Completely changed the course of direction of my PhD. I decided to do my PhD in this field specifically over going to do a PhD in physics. And I'm not upset about that whatsoever. I'm extremely happy. There are some deep theoretical implications with physics, so I haven't abandoned physics entirely. In fact, I feel like this is the best way for me to pursue physics right now in my education. I'm in love with this subject, and I just wanted to share it with y'all. And yeah, so have a wonderful day.